Good evening and welcome to today's Tropics for August 1st, 2020. Please note I am not a meteorologist and this video is just a collection of my thoughts and opinions about the storm I'm talking about. And for any decision making, please consult the National Hurricane Center or your local officials. So today I'm looking at Tropical Storm Isaias, and it struggled a lot today because yesterday it actually managed to get dry air into its circulation and shear increased, so the convection was sheared off and there's dry air getting in, and so for most of the day the circulation was actually exposed, and thus it weakened into tropical storm. Not that much, only down to 60 knots. But just recently, actually, only a couple hours ago, we had this very large convective burst here, and it is continuing to grow. And you can see some of the good outflow to the north. There isn't as much to the south because there is still some of that southerly shear. But it does seem like there might be a little period of reorganization if this can continue to keep firing and possibly realign the low-level center and the mid-level center, which actually became decoupled earlier because of that southerly and southwesterly wind shear that had been hitting Isaias. Looking at the infrared imagery, you can see how deep that convection is, and there's a pretty persistent area of negative 80 degree Celsius convection. So this is pretty deep convection, and if you do look at the loops earlier, can you see how there's some very shallow convection and some showers in that area, and I'm guessing it moistened that area, and eventually it allowed for deep convection. Now it's basically explosively firing, creating this very large blob. And we'll to see if it's more of a shear thing or if it can try to at least partially reorganize and Isaias and get it to become more an organized cyclone and possibly intensify just a little bit. However, despite the fact that the core is a bit more insulated and there is some convection over the center or near, pretty much over the center, there are still problems that Isaias will continue to see, especially in the next day or so. And you can see there's still that large area of dry air that is still there, and you could actually see it on the drop sound earlier. That was sampling the area just south of the storm, and while that isn't getting infected directly into the storm right now by the looks of it, see it gets very dry once you get above 700 millibars and even 850. But it gets really dry, especially towards its upper levels. So you're getting values as low as 4% of relative humidity. So that is extremely dry. And if the shear does increase a little more in the next day or so, then you might try to see that dry air try to reinfect back into the circulation, and that would mean it would probably have similar struggles because it wouldn't be able to fire convection where it's both sheared and just too dry to actually have that deep convection actually firing. Looking at the radar, you can see there's a little kind of spin here. It's not as well defined now. Maybe it's a bit further out, but it does seem that you can see the mid-level center here in the middle of this area of heavier precipitation. However, the issue is you're seeing that here, and that is about north of Andros Island here, except if you look at the recon here, mission here, see the center that's finding both isn't too fast really. It's moving a lot slower now, and that's partially because it's starting around the ridge, but it might also be because it is interacting with this new convective area. But you can see it's a lot further to the west, so that is some proof that it is decoupled, at least at the moment. And we'll have to see what this means in terms of what the mid-level center can do to it, because that might mean it can tug it a bit east or north. And those wobbles, you have to watch the wobbles for the impact on Florida, for Florida's east coast. So we'll definitely have to watch to see if it gets nudged one way, because that could have track implications for the east coast and maybe move it a bit further offshore, hopefully. This recent center pass from recon shows is another piece of evidence that these mid-level center and the low-level center are decoupled. So it's nice to have extra supporting data from both radar and recon. See the extrapolated pressure there. It's not always right, but it hits the minimum around here. So that's where we still have northerlies at flight level, and you don't actually get the actual low until it's a bit further to the northeast. And since the plane is at flight level, that means that it might be or is at flight level, which is more in the mid levels. That is some evidence that it might be a bit decoupled towards the northeast, or the mid level centers decoupled towards the northeast, which isn't really surprising given that there is southwesterly shear. Unfortunately, given the ferocity of this large convective blob, that means there are very strong updrafts and downdrafts depending on where you are in that blob, and that means you're going to have extreme turbulence in here, so it's actually more dangerous to fly in than, say, a more well-organized eye wall. So it seems to be a reason why you aren't having those passes right into this convection, because it's just simply too dangerous, and obviously you don't want the pilots and the crew in there to endanger themselves. But there is one piece of data that suggests, even if this is a mesoscale feature, that there are going to be some stronger winds as a result of this. You can see that as it gets further down, you actually have a pocket of hurricane force winds, and that calms down a bit to 50 knots at the surface. But it definitely looks like this convective area is helping to mix down some stronger winds from the loft, and you tend to see that with that convection, but that might keep the wind speed high and might even intensify it a little back into a hurricane, and that is what the National Hurricane Center does expect to happen for it to possibly intensify into a low-end Category 1, but we shall see how long this actually lasts, because there is a potential that we end up seeing this fizzle similar to the past few days. Still, despite the possibility for some reorganization in the short term, the environment around Isaias is currently still generally unfavorable. You can see in the upper level plots, this is valid at 0Z and Sunday, so that is just about when I'm recording. And you can see there's a pretty good anticyclone over Cuba. The problem is Isaias is currently in the Bahamas and not in Cuba, so that means it is still displaced, and you're not actually having as much southerly winds. It's starting to get displaced more to the west, so you're having a few different vectors, but right now it looks like it's in a region where you have some southwesterlies near it, and then some northerlies near it. It doesn't look quite as unfavorable, but does look like as it heads north, or generally northwest, north-northwest, it'll head more into this area of southwesterly wind aloft, and that is not favorable because it is still not moving to the northeast, and that means it'll probably get some more westerly shear continuing to hit it, and that means it will still continue to struggle in the next day or so. However, or that at the same time, the upper convergence you're seeing from this area of upper flow is causing some dry air upshear of Isaias, and that means you can get some dry air trying to wrap in. It's not always successful, but it was last night. So we'll see if it can try to wrap in, but it's definitely not a super favorable area where you can have dry air nearby that can get pushed into the storm as we had today. But we'll have to see, and of course, at the same time, the intensity affects the track. So these short-term wobbles and changes in intensity can tell you if we are going to see the core actually get onto Florida, but we'll really have to see if it's a stronger or weaker system tonight. At the same time, some of the East Coast, especially what looks to be Carolinas, don't want to sleep on the storm quite yet, especially if it stays offshore, because as it starts to move to the northeast and gets picked up by that trough, if it can stay on shore or offshore and has an actual structure, it'll eventually start to move to the northeast. And given that it's still going to be displaced from the anticyclone, you're going to still have or southwesterly winds aloft. Problem is, unlike now, you're going to have the storm that's moving in tandem with this upper level flow. So that means you're going to have some of the shear cancel out. So that means you're probably going to have lower shear over Isaias. And as you can see, there's a stronger area of winds aloft. So that's a jet associated with that trough. And that means you could have this entrance region help boost some outflow of Isaias and potentially have it strengthen in this region. So definitely keep an eye on the storm, and hopefully it doesn't, but there is a possibility you could see some intensification in this region if it stays on offshore and has some sort of structure to work with. But we'll really have to see early this week. That same sort of steering regime at the same time continues to exist, and basically what we're still looking at is a stronger storm that is going to feel the trough earlier, and will also be having flow that's less or that's slower and not quite as westerly. So you're still looking at this stronger storm east and weaker storm west type of motion, and you can see this well in the initialization here of the GFS model, and you can see that there's not really much of a strong high towards the northeast, and you have this trough coming down, so that would mean you don't have as much flow for a stronger storm, and that would mean it wouldn't really move that far west into or near Florida before the trough comes in and then eventually picks Isaias up. However, you don't have that same eroded ridge type feature at the lower levels. In fact, the high pressure at lower levels here is a lot more impressive, and you can see definitely where it's centered right about here. And as a result, you're going to have a bit faster flow and more to the south, more to the northwest. So it really depends on if Isaias can strengthen a little last minute, and how far northwest it can go before it starts turning more to the north, because that could mean landfall on the east coast of Florida. And then we'll have to see how things trend, because there are some external features that will continue changing in the next day or so even. But we'll really have to watch the wobbles and the changes in intensity in Isaias, because those are going to be very important to see whether the core actually makes the core gets to Florida and possibly brings bigger impacts than what is already expected, and what would happen without a core on land. Looking at the official National Hurricane Center forecast, you can see that the watches and warnings are starting to creep up a bit now. Now there is a tropical storm watch on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, so that's going to continue climbing as Isaias climbs. And you can see there is still the hurricane warning on the east coast of Florida, and surrounding tropical storm warnings, unless you're way at the north coast or northeastern coast of Florida. It's probably too late to do most of your preparations, but hopefully you are already prepared, because it is coming very soon. And even if it is a weaker system, there are going to be associated thunderstorms where you are going to have higher wind and possibly flooding rain. So even if it does start to look less organized, please do not let your guard down, because you could still see impacts that may cause damage. So be prepared for that. Make sure that you're prepared for flooding if you are in a flood-prone area, because there is likely going to be at least a few feet of surge with this system, and at the same time, there might be rain that could flood the area or your area. So definitely be prepared for that as well. And then again, further up the coast, keep an eye on the storm, because it could come to you on Tuesday, it looks like. So definitely, if you are in this cone, be prepared, even if it does look less impressive, because we have seen this pulsate between very unimpressive structure and more impressive structure. So please do be prepared for worst case scenario, but as always, hope for the best case scenario to happen. Now it's August 1st, and I was planning to make a hurricane season or seasonal outlook for the hurricane season, except I wasn't quite expecting this kind of activity early on. So I kind of got sidetracked with these storms. So I don't really have a hard look at this in terms of numbers, but I'm going to take a little more qualitative look at what's going on. And at this point, it'd be almost difficult to not have at least an active season, but it seems a more active or even hyperactive season seems more likely at this point because the conditions are just overall pretty favorable. You haven't had too much activity in the Eastern Pacific so far, so an inactive start to the Pacific hurricane season, especially Eastern Pacific here, means you're going to have less shear coming from these tropical cyclones and less sinking motion. That's indeed what we're seeing, because the shear has been pretty unimpressive in the Atlantic Basin right now. You haven't seen that normal tutlow that usually tends to shear storms. Instead, the problem with a lot of these storms is drier air instead of shear. You can see this pretty decent negative ENSO signature here. So that means, again, you're going to have a similar thing where you have sinking air in the dateline region, and as a result, you have less shear in the Atlantic, and that means there's less sinking air in this region. And at the same time, you have a very strong West African monsoon that's been pumping out impressive waves, which at the same time have also been developing. You have this very warm tropical region, which has actually warmed quite a bit this month, or in the past month, to some of the warmest in average. And you've also had three tropical cyclones before August developed directly in the deep tropics, and two hurricanes, which are Isaias and Hannah, which, while they didn't do this directly in the deep tropics, they ended up becoming hurricanes, and they're both from tropical origins, as in a tropical wave out of Africa. So there might be a few speed bumps, like for example, if you do have this kind of dry air persist or something, that might take the season down a notch a bit, or you just have unforeseen things that can take down the activity. But sadly, it does look like we do have a very active season on tap, given that the early season has been quite active and has had quite a bit of deep tropical activity, and that tends to foreshadow a more active season. But we'll definitely have to see. Otherwise, there is some activity picking up actually in the Western Pacific, and that's actually been quite quiet there. First tropical cyclones quite a while, actually since I think June. So the Western Pacific is actually waking up, which is surprising it took this long. Otherwise, there isn't too much going on in the tropics other than the system out in the Atlantic or in Central Atlantic and TD10. But again, otherwise, there isn't much outside of that. Hope you liked my video. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know, and thanks for watching.